All right, let's get into the third and final installment of Building Self-Intimacy. This has been a 3-part series based off of the suggestions of Osho in his fantastic compilation book, Intimacy, Trusting Oneself and the Other. These are some of the principles that Osho goes over in the book regarding building self-intimacy. So if you haven't watched the first 2 installments of this little mini-series I've done, which is the first one being on listening to your inner voice. I believe I just titled it Your Inner Voice. And the second part regarding feelings and actually just being able to feel what you're feeling without any level of suppression or repression. And we'll finish this off by talking about the final thing Osho mentions here, where he's talking about being completely in the present moment. And he makes a very unique point where he's saying being in the present moment in such a way where you're not allowing the past or the future to spoil or poison, I think poison is the term he uses, poison the present moment for you. And this idea of being present is obviously kind of a buzzword at this point. Sort of like living in the now is kind of it's like a colloquial thing. Like we'll often say like, oh, just live in the now, be more present. But it's because it's so common, it's often sometimes like hard to get a real sense of what that actually is that we're referring to. And notice that I'm not saying what it is we mean, because we don't want to get lost in a whole bunch of deep descriptions on what it really means to be present, or if you are or are not present. Because the reality of the situation, if we're willing to look, is that we cannot not be present. We are always in this moment. We have always been in this moment. And even when we say, oh, do you remember that moment? Or do you remember this moment? Or we're going to be moving towards this moment. It's interesting how we sometimes have this way of sort of contextualizing our lives, or sort of like a time, I suppose, where we'll sort of fragment things into these individual moments. But with a little bit of attention paid to it, it's kind of obvious, isn't it, that there really is only actually this. There is really only this moment. And whether you are living right within this moment and listening to your inner voice and actually acknowledging yourself, and like we said in the first installment of this series, not allowing your consciousness to be completely controlled and subjugated, saturated by the opinions of what's going on around you, and oftentimes the jumpy survival needs of a culture or a family or even a peer group. If that's not being saturated and you are actually learning to listen to yourself more closely, as we talked about in that installment, and second of all, if you are actually in touch with the motion of what you're feeling and who you are, and the simplest example there being, if you're angry, you're angry. If you're sad, you're sad. If you're happy, you're happy, and those feeling tones change from moment to moment. That's a law of nature. There's always a continuous flux and change within reality. And knowing yourself as a kind of harmonic structure within that reality and allowing that to occur. And sort of, as I said in that video, the second installment, giving up that sense of sort of megalomania of constantly trying to control how we're going to be and how we are, and instead allowing what we really are to shine through. With these 2 principles starting to be integrated more and getting them a bit more fleshed out, it starts to kind of come down to this third principle where we recognize that what we actually are can only really be here now. It's only something that can exist within this moment, because this moment is all there is. When you are listening to yourself and you are in touch with what you're feeling and you're not trying to alter it or change it in any kind of way, it becomes very obvious that you get to sort of like the, as they say in Zen, the razor's edge of your experience. And what you're feeling becomes a lot more intimate. Hence the name of the series. What you're thinking, the way you register what it is that you want and who it is that you are, and what it is that you're feeling becomes a lot closer. We literally mean intimate in terms of closeness. There's a sense that you're closely connected to what you are. And when you're so closely connected to what you are like that, it just becomes obvious that it's a constantly moving rhythm. There's a constant rhythm that you're always in. And getting in more touch with that sort of vivifies and adds this kind of aliveness element that I think a lot of us can be missing when we're allowing our lives to be saturated by thoughts of what we should be, could be, what we were, And we all know what that's like. We all know what it's like to be in a situation where we maybe said something at some point, we maybe behaved in a certain kind of way, and then we ruminate on it and we stay stuck in it. And again, even that memory of the past can only really exist now. We're actually re-evoking and experiencing the past now. But notice how it's poisoning the now, because there's no real control we have over it. There's no real power we have over it. And we're often trying to change the way that we feel. When we remember something that was uncomfortable for us and we're ruminating on it and we're stuck on it, which indicates a lot of resistance, we are in a place where we're trying to change it and we can't. So we're living in a place where, when you think about it just a bit objectively, if you take an eagle-eyed view of the situation, it just leads to more suffering. It can't really go anywhere else. And it's almost like we get sort of subtly addicted to this kind of suffering. We start to know it as who we are, and we start to actually identify with that. And I'm sure you've met people like that, or maybe you even refer to yourself like that. I was actually with someone recently who actually said those exact things to me. I'm someone who ruminates a lot. And there's this sense of contracting down on this sense of like identifying in this kind of like, I ruminate a lot. It's done so much that it becomes a feature of who it is we think we are. And it can be the exact same way with the future, right? The difference tends to be that when it comes to future, we're a lot more rewarded by looking ahead in that way, because there are obviously positive, inspirational aspects of having a vision. But there's also a flip side to that, which is becoming obsessed with what it is that you think you're going to be and what you're becoming, what you're going to be doing, what you're doing to get there, so much so that it completely discredits and sucks the life out of the present. And it comes with the old sort of like very obvious limiting belief that I'll be happy when I X, I'll be fulfilled when I get this. And I don't know about you, but for me at this point, it's just very obvious that that's really not how it works. And it's evidenced quite clearly by the great amount of history and information that we have on every different kinds of people in every different kind of culture who did achieve what they wanted, and it didn't actually fulfill them. And they actually sometimes ended up worse, because at least before you fulfill what it is that you want, you have the plausible deniability of assuming that by having it, you'd be happy, and you're not now because you don't. Sort of pays credence to the Buddha's saying, I think I was mentioning in one of the recent videos as well, the Buddha's saying that there are two ways to suffer. You can not get what you want or get exactly what you want, right? It's still in a place of wanting. It's still ultimately living from a place of stomach-centered desire. It's not quite moved up to that level of actually being. What we're talking about with self-intimacy in this series, really, when you get down to it, it's learning how to live more from the place of your heart and your actual expression, moving through your voice, moving through your heart, moving through the clarity of how you see the situation. They're higher aspects of experience. They're not the kind of aspects of experience where you stay caught in a survival state, trying to alter how you feel so you can get a certain outcome, never listening to yourself and never really experiencing what is now. It's very much the opposite of that. All of these 3 points on self-intimacy are really one point, and it could just be summed up as this is what it is. It is actually the way that it is. And although at first that might sometimes seem scary, because we're often very attached to the notion that it's not okay right now, or we're not good enough, we're not okay right now, when we actually start to move with this and we get a sense of harmony, or to use the Greek term eudaimonia, right, to be in harmony with nature, I think when we actually start to get in touch with this more, we get on that razor's edge in the present moment, and it's almost like life gets concentrated down to what this is actually right now. And when we can see clearly from where we are right now and what this experience is right now, it becomes less worrying. I think there's a lessening of anxiety. I've often felt a lot of anxiety for different points throughout my life for different reasons, and really coming down to it, I often think that it's just been to do with the fact that it's like, oh, things might be like this, or, oh, like, do you remember when stuff was like that? And you're kind of worrying about how it was, but you're not realizing that the thing that's actually bothering you the most is just how you feel about these circumstances. It's not the circumstances themselves. And you feel like that because you're afraid to feel those things, and so you resist them and try to suppress them, and then they unconsciously influence all of your life, behavior, decisions, and attractions and aversions anyway. As Carl Jung pointed out so many years ago, right? There's a sense that even though you might not be conscious of what it is, it still influences you very greatly. So this final point really comes down to being able to live consciously here and now. And I would go ahead and say that a lot of teachers of the cut of people like Osho, I think, as incredible as their teachings are, they sometimes do become a little bit distant. And it makes sense, right? They're teaching us kind of a specific thing at a specific level of awareness, but I think a lot of the time they do sort of become distant from what most people are going through or experiencing with regards to, like, for example, difficulty experiencing things in the present moment. So I'm going to go ahead and share a couple of suggestions of ways that I notice this amplified in my life, and hopefully you can pick up on something in it, and it might spark something in you. So maybe just listen closely to that. So last night I work very late. I work overnight shifts, and last night before I went into my job, I saw this tree outside, and I had like 10 minutes until I started. And I just made a decision, like I set a conscious intention. I noticed this leaf just coming out of the side of the tree, and I set this conscious intention where I was like, I'm going to go and just like pay attention to this leaf for 5 minutes. I'm just going to be with this leaf and just really see it. And it's funny, right? Because you think about it and it's like, what could be a more natural thing in the world than just going to notice a product of nature and just being able to be with it and just being able to see it clearly? There's something so childlike and natural about that. But we're often disconnected from that, right? Like, we might not think that's valuable, or even worse, sometimes we might try to do it and just notice that we have no real wonder in us. It's like, if we're being honest with ourselves with how we actually feel, maybe we don't care about the leaf. We don't care about what's going on actually in the moment. So it's like setting a conscious intention to appreciate something. And the way that I would go about doing this, the way that I go about it is, instead of like trying to force myself to feel something for it or force myself to have a certain kind of experience, because that doesn't really work and you wouldn't want to do that. You wouldn't want to control yourself, as per part 2 of this series. When that intention's set, when you set an intention, all of the stuff that gets in the way of the intention being actualized comes to the surface really quickly. It's an interesting little attraction trick. So when I would notice the leaf, I would notice any kind of resistance that I might have to actually just being in the presence of this leaf and this tree. And then the whole thing is just to be with that resistance. It's not to change it. It's not to watch videos on how to get over it. They all have their own place, but that's not what this is. This is just being in that resistance, and it's just allowing that resistance and that inability to appreciate and experience this leaf or this tree, this landscape, this person's eyes, whatever it is. It's being able to allow that to be there completely and just notice how it's there in the awareness. And then when it becomes conscious to us like that, and it's not just this resistance that we carry around like semi-consciously, it's wonderful because it becomes something that, again, we stop fighting it, and it just is a feeling that just kind of like moves through awareness like that. And when we have this feeling moving through our awareness, we can really bring it into the present moment and experience it directly. And when we're doing that, it's like we can release that, and before we know it, we are actually experiencing what it is. We're allowing that sort of present moment experience to really vivify us. It can be challenging at first because with this stuff with self-intimacy, it sounds cool. It sounds kind of like, oh yeah, a more intimate experience of life. But intimacy is confronting because it's very close to the heart. It's very raw and very direct. And when you start noticing that you have more self-intimacy, the way that you feel about the people in your life or the circumstances in your life, it can be very sharp and direct. It's wonderful because oftentimes it's just suppressed feelings that we haven't been able to access. There's old feelings that sort of clog us up, and then we're refreshing that and being a bit more honest about our own experience. But it can be intense, nevertheless. So yeah, it could be the same thing with, like, recently I went to an event And this was a funny party to go to. My friend was running it as a workshop. And as soon as I walk into this party, I was kind of expecting to go into this, people hanging out, like sort of dancing or like kicking back, talking. And they were all sitting in a circle doing eye gazing with one another. So I managed to get into the party just for the last moment. And I'd never met this girl before who I sat next to. And she was my partner here because there was one spare person. And I just sat with her, never met her before. And we sort of interlocked our hands and we did the eye gazing for a few minutes. And it was interesting because similar to looking at the leaf, what I noticed was there was a sense of tension that came up. But by being with that tension and admitting it and not trying to change it, it's like I actually felt like I had a really intimate connection with someone whom I've never actually met before. It was something like that. It was a sort of allowing, because sometimes we might think of like, oh, eye gazing with a stranger. It's kind of like, it's a bit intrusive almost, and it's like, yeah, because it's close. Sometimes we like to glorify and become very pedantic and proud of the kind of boundaries that we have. And although it's really important to have boundaries so we can remain safe and centered in ourselves and we can have the kind of life that we want, we don't just get dragged into other people's stuff. At the same time, when we get too attached to boundaries, sometimes we do lose that sharp razor's edge aspect of actually being intimate with our experience of life. And this was a good example of something where it was just like, you just say yes to the experience and see what happens. And yeah, it does bring stuff up. Being intimate in your experience, I want you to understand this, so this series isn't just become something you watch and it's like, oh yeah, it's cool, self-intimacy, it's like this cool, it's like, no, actually when you are really intimate with yourself, you can't really go back with it. When you start experiencing that, you recognize this is more the truth of what you actually are. You feel in harmony with things, but this does bring up strong feelings. It does, that inner voice that we spoke about in the first part might tell you things that are different from the way you've been operating for a long time. It reminds me of Joseph Campbell, if you've heard his story, his origin story, where he's doing this PhD, I believe, and he has to write this one last assignment for his PhD. Has to write this, what do they call it when they're doing their PhD, like a doctorate or whatever. What do they call that last assignment? A thesis. He has to do this thesis, and he has these two options. So he has this intuitive idea where he can move out to a cabin in the woods and just read books and follow his life purpose, which he knows in his heart he should do. That's the hero's journey. He's read enough myth to know that that's something, read enough and then just experienced enough to know that that's how it's done. Or he can do this thesis and take the safe path. And obviously, we wouldn't be talking about it if he had have took the thesis. He does go into following his bliss, and even released a fantastic book that you can check out called Follow Your Bliss, Joseph Campbell. This concept of when something's quite vivid for you, that inner voice picks up on it. We spoke about that in the video. And moving your life in that direction can be scary, because sometimes, at least initially, it seems against what we are doing for our own survival that we might usually be doing. But as we move in the direction that we really want to, when we listen to ourselves, it's often interesting to note how creative we can become from that place, and how much more centered and kind we can be to the people around us, and how we can attract opportunities more in alignment with us. And then following that with the second part of this being that does bring up a lot of experience that's kind of new and fresh. And when we become more intimate, we have to sort of expand our feeling repertoire, like our ability to feel these things. It's like we have to expand into it, and that can be time consuming and patient, and it can only be done in the present moment, which is where we will finish this off. Just being able to be here with this, and recognizing that even if we're in the future, even if we're in the past, they are thoughts that we're getting attached to within this, because there is only really just this. And there's something wonderful about that. There's something freeing about it as well, because it loosens the pressure to things. It adds an intensity, but loosens the pressure. Lowers anxiety, but also adds directness to experience. And you can feel that presence in a person's being, and people will feel it in your being as well as you are developing this further. So I appreciate you tuning in for the final installment of Self-Intimacy. I hope you enjoyed this little mini-series. It was fun to make, fun to flesh these concepts out further, kind of free associatively for you and myself. I'm enjoying reading this book. If you did get value out of the series, I appreciate you subscribing to the channel, liking the video, and leaving comments down below. It helps the algorithm churn the videos quicker. Sharing this to anyone you feel like would get value out of it. For everyone who has been, I see like there's about 1,000 of you who are returning viewers, and I just want to say to you, thank you very much. The appreciation I have is massive. It's really amazing to see people commenting who watch the videos really frequently. It feels like we're building a bit of a community with this, which I just really happy about. So thank you very much for that. I hope that you got value out of this series as per usual, and we'll be back very soon with more stuff. Hope you're having a beautiful day, and that's me.